The first 3 weeks of the eruption here in Hawaii, crazy things would happen in the middle of the night. A new fissure would open up and it would threaten a new neighborhood. Thousands of people are evacuated from their homes. I started the Hawaii Tracker Facebook group to help people understand what's going on and get their questions answered.
Hey, how's it going? We're live. This is Fissure 20.
We had hundreds of people all throughout the neighborhoods sending in videos, articles, and images. We spend a lot of time making sure the accurate information gets out.
This is live. There's still lava moving.
They weren't just sharing a story, they were helping their neighbor. If a family was being evacuated, my group would just jump in and help out. So it was huge. They were watching out for each other.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the support from everybody.
As we go through this, we're growing closer together as a community. When tragedies like this strike, you really realize how much you need each other.
We are the Hawaiian Volcano Education and Resilience Institute, HVERI for short. A lot of people know us from the 2018 eruption of Kilauea in the Lower East Rift Zone. Working under Hawaii Tracker on the Facebook group. Since then, we've been trying to carry on and take the lessons, the hard lessons that were learned during that eruption and try and prepare for the next major disaster that comes to our island.
Yeah, so we do that through two different programs. One is volcano education, and the other part is digital resilience, which we address through online groups on social media. So the way the two programs work together is that the social media networks end up being a distribution pathway for all the information. And having that network in place means we can provide more than just volcano education, but any other preparedness information as well.
What we were working for really came about in the Mauna Loa eruption in 2022. Within hours of that eruption starting, we had the mayor, Mitch Roth, we had USGS HVO Ken Hahn on the stream trying to help flush out a little bit of the ongoing because it's so new. It's completely different from our previous major eruption, which was 2018.
One of the things that Talmadge and I were talking about was how do we deal with social media? And it was something we needed to figure out and get right. Our job is to get information to the public and make sure that the public get it as well as possible and as correctly as possible. When Philip and Dane started coming to you and live streaming the meetings, it was great because we were reaching more people than we normally would. So when the eruption actually happened, we had this relationship. The interviews we did during the eruption, the most fun ones were the ones with Philip and Dave because they were more relaxed, and we knew we were getting to the local community, and people were asking questions. So those were the best, I think. I just want to really give a shout out to those guys and how we worked as a team on this eruption. It really worked out well, and we got to a lot of people we wouldn't have normally got.
Aloha, everyone. I'm geologist Philip Ong with Mr. Dane DuPont from the nonprofit HVERI, the Hawaiian Volcano Education and Resilience Institute. Today is Thursday, October 17th, 2024. It's a little bit slow out there on the volcano on Kilauea and Mauna Loa. The fire is out apparently, but we have some earthquake awareness to talk about today. Is October, and earlier today was the Great Hawaii Shakeout. So that's our menu today. How are you doing today, Dane?
Doing pretty good. Yeah, we're up at the park this week, and the construction's still going on. We'll have an update on that, talk about that a little bit more. But yeah, it's interesting to see it quiet up there, essentially, as much as it can be right now.
Yeah, awesome. So we'll get right into it this week. Dane will be leading discussion on chat and collecting questions for our mid-break. We'll kind of go through our modern, up-to-date, what's happening right now in a volcano for our first half, and then we'll go into some of our awareness in the back half today. So get your questions in. And with that said, we'll get our screen switched around here and get ready to give you guys our summary for this week. Hello, everyone. This is Hawaiian Volcano Summary for October 17th, 2024. This week, Kilauea has been pretty quiet. Earthquakes continue at a low rate around the summit and the East Rift, and more so on the south flank that's seaward of the areas that have been moving recently, including the eruption about 1 month ago. If we look at the earthquake counts overall, they're similar to last week, over this past week. However, on closer inspection, when you look at the earthquakes plotted depth versus time, then you can see that in the shallow zones, many of these earthquakes have actually decreased from what they were the previous week. And in fact, we have a little bit above our usual counts of deep earthquakes from Pahala contributing to the counts this week. So earthquakes are down, deformation is down on a volcano. If we look at the ground tilt at the summit by the Sand Hill Station, we can see the volcano has been gradually inflating ever since the eruption ended around the 25th. And it's done so with slightly faster, slightly slower pulses. But over this last week, it has been gradually and somewhat slow. This is both this blue line, which is the azimuth for the Halemau'u area, and the green line, which is the azimuth towards the South Caldera area. So in total, you can see that since the eruption ended, we've come up on the order of perhaps a little less than 10 microradians or so. So moderate inflation at the summit. If we move over towards the Middle East Rift and the recent eruption site, which is west of Puʻuʻōʻō crater, where this tilt meter is located. So the green component picks up the signal from that direction. And following the eruption, we saw that there was inflation that had resumed in that Middle East Rift area. A little more, a little less, with a pulse that came in about a week ago. And much of this last week has been fairly steady, if not slightly deflating. So it seems like the Middle East Rift has slowed its magma supply. And in between, if we look at the escape road tilt meter here, it's showing an in-between signal as well. So that's the story on Kilauea this week. It's still slowly inflating to the East Rift. We're waiting the pressure to keep building and see what develops next. On neighboring Mauna Loa, these are the earthquakes for the whole last month. And you can see there are not a whole lot, but they are occurring at a background rate around the summit area. Looking at the time and depth over the last month of Mauna Loa, you can see that there are all in the shallow regions of the volcano here, with occasionally earlier in a month, these deeper events. So if we look at the monthly rates, we did see a little bit of a increase to 9 earthquakes last week, but it's been much slower and at the background close to 0 ever since. So the real picture in a grand scheme of things is better portrayed like this. Over the last 5 years, earthquakes per month are down at their lowest levels that they have been ever since the eruption ended. And that's our Hawaiian Volcano Summary for this week. And with that, we'll today move on to our VOG measurement and prediction VMAP project, which summarizes our gas hazards here, are still of our most likely volcanic risk today. And it's actually quite low. So right now is one of the least hazardous times on Kilauea. If you're one of these people that are risk averse and it's exciting to hear about the earthquakes, but you don't want to be here when they're happening, and it's exciting to see about the explosions and eruptions, but you don't want to be too close, then this might be the time to come. The VOG forecast now coming from Kilauea is at around 60 tons per day. And you barely see it registering on this VOG forecast for the next couple of days here. It does seem like there is this one patch that blows out from Volcano and heads towards Mauna Loa summit. It's interesting how the gas gets sucked up in that direction, like a breath of Kīlauea going towards Mauna Loa summit there. But that is just a transient feature of the forecast here. Clears up pretty fast. So that's really it for the gas, and we'll move on to our observations, of which there are also not that many, but we will start with the NASA FIRMS, which is the Fire Information for Resource Management System. This is a map that shows satellite detections of heat on the surface of the Earth. And last week we saw heat signals from around Nāpau Crater, as there was still cooling lava flow and perhaps some smoldering wildfire there. And today you can see there is nothing on the map. And so that's really as important as what we showed yesterday, that it does not seem to be appearing on monitors any longer. We can look at the PW camera on the west flank of Puʻuʻōʻō that looks west. Here's a current view as of about half an hour ago. And it's hard to see that somewhere in here is where that fire was smoldering. So as usual, I've taken this and compiled a time lapse for you guys. And so let's just play the last week. So you see a little bit of the fire glow and smolder happening in here. And I'll blow it up in a minute here, but let's just play you guys the wide view to start. So Friday and Saturday are quiet. And on Sunday, there's a little puff that comes up right in there somewhere. And that was it. And that's the last sign we had of that wildfire 4 days ago. And the video continues over the last 4 days, and it comes and goes. And you see a little bit of fume from the actual eruption site over here. Some clouds come in. There's been some increased rainy weather in the area. So perhaps that has a part in it as well. But let's show it to you guys enlarged. And now I'm showing you the full sequence. So when a fire starts, you can see the glow here on the west side of the crater, migrates around to that southwest side. We see the whole area being affected. Not further over than that, all the way over here by the fire here in the later stages. So here we are, Thursday, Friday. I seem to have quieted down. Saturday is quiet as well. And here comes Sunday, and we're looking in here, I believe. Oh, just to the left of there. Let me pull it back, and it'll be in here. I'm trying to not cover it up. Let's just let it play here. There it is again, that little puff right there. So that was it. That's the last we saw of it. And no glow, no fume, no anything we can see from that camera. A little bit coming up from the eruption site, and so we'll turn to the S2 camera next, which is that closer one. And here's a view from about 45 minutes ago. It's a little bit of gas coming up here, and maybe the extra steam is from the extra rainfall that's coming through. So the time lapse for the last week from this camera, so you can see how that is changing. You can see some different views of some days it's nice and dry, and you don't see any fume at all. You do see interesting reflections on the nice shiny Pahoehoe flows on that lava channel. And clear days, and here comes some rain. And maybe after this rain comes through, you see a little bit more fume in that area right in there. Such as right in there. Let's see if I can get that bigger on the screen. Let's see a little bit more in a still frame right there, that zone of steam. And that's our visuals for this week. And USGS reports that this is all steam and no sulfurous gases are being detected coming from this area. So we'll move on to our earthquakes from here. And starting off with, let's see, this is the default map of Kilauea here. Let's see, I might have to get the controls to force them to load here. Is it coming? There they are. All right, so past flows, let's turn those off. Turn off the recent flows too, so we can show you guys where the earthquakes actually are. And let's zoom it out to the whole map here. And here we have earthquakes plotted by depth for the last 2 days. So the blue ones are the deepest ones in Pahala. We have yellow intermediate. Here's a larger one, 3.3, 7.5 miles down under this area between Kohala and Mauna Kea. And here are Kilauea events, which are very few this week compared to usual. It almost falls into the same pattern as a background, which here we have a shallow one, 2.2 on the west flank of Mauna Loa, a couple down here towards Loihi, 2.3 and 2.2, about 4.5 miles down. And that's the big picture for the last 2 days. If I include the last 2 weeks, you can see a little bit more popping up on the screen here, especially in Kilauea. So I really want to contrast, right, how quiet it is right now. Nothing under the summit, only a couple events here in the near rift south flank, and pretty quiet. So we'll move on to looking at the other version of this map, and we'll see what the largest one across the island over the last 1 day is at 2.5. That one up here, 2.4 in Pahala. Let's put it to the last 7 days to give us a bigger window. So 3.3, 3.2 under Pahala was the largest in that cluster this week. And nothing too large otherwise. On Kilauea, if we zoom it in to right there, let's put it. Our largest was at 2.4, which was this event here on this near south flank, and these little aftershocks that followed it. So pretty quiet for earthquakes this week as well. We will look at the monitoring signals in more depth than just the earthquakes. So let's start off by going through the USGS daily updates. Not every single one, but highlighting the changes that occur. And then the most notable thing this last week was a fire. So I can point out that on Monday, on the 14th, this is the day after they had detected that puff of smoke on the PW camera from Sunday, right? They still note that the wildfire that began during eruption continued to smolder at that time, with wildfire smoke intermittently visible. That's the notable highlight from that day, because on Tuesday, we see that text disappear. And there is no mention of the fire from that day forward. So that's really the biggest change over the past week. And I'll just jump us to today's daily update, which is the most current and restates much of the same information, which is we don't have an eruption. We do have steaming and no major changes. Gas emissions are still low. Earthquakes are low. And the biggest, most important part of this update is the area down here where they give an analysis that even though the eruption is over, unrest is at low levels, data shows magma still moving at a low rate from the summit to the Middle East rift zone. So because of that, there could be more intrusions and eruptions. Right, that's basically it. More intrusions and eruptions could happen if this continued magma supply. So that's our daily updates, and we'll turn to some of our data streams from the USGS. And I'll start off with our tilt set, looking at the last 2 days where you see a fairly normal signal, except if you look at the scale, it's extremely zoomed in. So these are just very little wiggles. You can even see the fuzziness in the line because we're zoomed in so far on this graph. So barely any change over the last 2 days, essentially. If you look over the last 1 week, we see a really strange signal. Here we see that on the 11th and the 12th, we're all the way up here. Sometime during a workday on the 12th, we see this big change. Seems like maybe it takes over 15 minutes to whatever change is happening there, and it restabilizes down here. This step is not mentioned in any of the reports. If we look at a station that we showed you on our summary and the Sand Hill, we do not see the signal. So what we can say is whatever this is localized to the Uikahuna site, whether it was some calibration they did or some of the construction nearby has affected something. I do not have further information to share myself. So if anyone knows more, please do share with us. but otherwise it's something localized to that area of Uekahuna. So on a month-long plot, it shows up as well. Here it is. So we'll just keep going past that. And Kilauea is showing more of a real signal here. So this mirrors a summit, but as we've mentioned before, we prefer to read the Sandhill instrument as it's got a clear separation between its components to Halemaumau and to the South Caldera. So, and they both show that inflationary trend, as we stated earlier. In fact, maybe a little bit of a pulse coming in first in the summit area, then in the South Caldera, then in the summit area again, and regardless, they both seem to have stabilized. If anything, the Halemaumau area seems to be a little slower than the South Caldera just today, because yesterday it looks a lot more similar. Yeah, and a rift, as we mentioned, it's hard to see in this 1 month plot, but we had seen more of a gradual decrease as a background signal on this station, on this green azimuth here. That seemed to have slowed during that eruption. As magma was supplied in, it actually seemed to receive some magma, it looked like, for a little while here, and that seems to have ended, and now we're at a stable, not really gaining or losing anything, right? Which is still a signal of slight filling above the trend of it dropping down, which it was doing before. But still, it's a very slight signal here on the Middle East rift, which is why we're saying everything is slowed down on the volcano. So at Puʻuʻōʻō, further east, this perhaps is the most telling signal here, that this is so flat over the last week after having shown that increase the previous week. So I won't keep beating that horse to death. Just move on and show you further down at Jonica. We're seeing daily variations. We're seeing a very zoomed in scale for our graph as well. And so there's not really anything to note here on this signal right now. So that's it for our tilt. We'll move on to some of our other syntheses, which are comparing the tilt graphs to the earthquake graphs and seeing how they correspond to each other here. So let me come to the top. All right, we can't really see much with this tilt graph, so we'll move on. But we can compare this 1 week of earthquake counts. When we just look at this plane, it looks like there's just a regular steady rate of earthquakes happening. And here's where we can break it down a little further and see that these 4 days of higher earthquakes really correspond to the larger Pahala event and aftershock sequence. You can see this came in, and there's many more events during this 4-day window right here in this lower depth range than in the shallow one here. So interesting to note that that's what's causing this little bump. And so overall, the earthquakes in the shallow region are actually lower. And we'll see that more clearly on a 1 month long plot of the same nature here. So let's get ourselves down there. There's our cross section. Maybe worth noting that there's also an extra little cluster of deep earthquakes just south of Kilauea caldera. Here they are on the map right here. And this is part of that feeder pathway that we believe comes into Kilauea from the south, which adds to another one from Pahala that we think comes in from that direction. All of them with a big question mark because they don't seem to always be active, right? Sometimes more so than others. So there's our earthquake cross-section and pathways. And let's come down to what we were talking about, our 1 month version of that plot, depth versus time. And so here you can see that if you especially look at the yellows, we had a much stronger band over the previous week that seems to have largely quieted during this most recent week. And even in the shallower oranges and reds, there's a little bit less here than we were seeing in previous weeks. There and there. We'll just wait and see. You can't see that detail when you look at the counts just all added up per day, which is why it's interesting to look at that breakdown once in a while. In this counts per day, you can see that the last 2 days have been lower overall than the rest of the week and the week before. So it may be that we had dropped off actually over here, and this little pulse is the extra deep flurry. And so we actually are continuing that post-eruption quiet trend. Over the last year, earthquakes per week, it looks like this. We're still down pretty low, less than 500. It's still all following the eruption. And over the last 5 years, earthquakes per month, we're going to end up pretty quiet this month, since most of it is following the end of that eruption last month. So we'll see how that goes. Coming now to our GPS, we can celebrate here that it looks like we have data re-emerging on the right side of this graph, at least on this caldera station. So we don't currently have an update of what happened in between here, but we can see that the newest plots are showing the caldera is slightly contracted from what it was about, what's that, end of August, 2 months ago or so. And so slightly contracted, which would make sense considering we've had the eruption. We can't really know what's in here until they fill it back in, but we do know that the volcano was expanding until it got to that eruption, and it probably dropped then, so it probably looked like something like this, and then maybe coming back up like that. Right? That's just our guess, given what we saw from other signals, and very, very roughly in here. The Puʻuʻōʻō station has not had data reemergence because one of them has not pulling its data, so we can look in more detail at what the GPS stations are showing us now that the data is coming back in. And just to remind you guys, these are now 2-year GPS plots that are broken into 3 panels, each of them. The upper one is an east-west, the middle one is a north-south, and the bottom one is the one that I like to look at the most, is the up and down signal, because that's the one that's easiest to tell if magma is pushing you from below or not. And everything moves in other directions, more or less, and that's interesting as well, but harder to summarize at a glance here. So to start off, let's just look at these new data points. And let me zoom it in here so you can see that there are 2 circles. All right, so that would be 2 days of data. Now, we always have a caveat when the data pops up on this side of the graph that there are automatic calculations of the GPS solutions, and they're based on the orbit of the satellite around the Earth, which is calculated as well. But in actual practice, when a satellite's flying over there, it doesn't fly exactly where it thought it would. So they then correct that orbit after the fact, and then they can correct all the data that comes from that as well. And so sometimes we see that correction be greater, and sometimes it's a little bit less. And so we don't know exactly how much these will shift or how accurate these are right now. But since it's all we have to go on, we'll walk out on this limb today, just for the basis of overall comparison, and say that the summit is at a lower level today than it was 2 months ago as well. Right, on a vertical measure at Wikahuna. And we maybe sketched out what that might have looked like changing between here and there, but the bottom line is right now we're at a lower state of bulging than we were 2 months ago. So that's buying us some time until the next thing happens. Not only that, if we look at the 2 data points between themselves, they're both fairly close together. And if anything, maybe slightly dropping, such that the volcano is not greatly swelling at this point in time. It still seems to be recovering from that eruption, is as general as what we can put it. And likewise, the other signals, we won't figure out which way they're going. They're also stable with the 2 data points plotting almost on each other as well. So those are the things we can look at with this early data set. All around the summit, we can see that everything is down from before. We're down at Wikahuna. We're down over on the east. We're down on the southeast. We're down in the south. If we move out of the caldera to the southwest, we're down over there as well. If we move south, we're down there as well. So that's the story. Everywhere the caldera is net deflated, but having resumed that swelling since the eruption ended. Moving to the Upper East Rift, Puhimau area is actually down as well from what it was 2 months ago, and plotting consistently, like not moving very much. Those 2 circles are almost one on top of the other. Same here. And zoomed in, maybe a little bit more movement visible right there. Keeping moving down the Southeast Rift, we're down at Devil's Throat. We're a little bit closer to stable at Mauna Ulu, which is near where that magma was bulging underground to feed the eruption site. So that's a little more interesting. Now we're getting to near where the magma has maybe left more of a lasting impact. So we come over to Kananui-Ohamo, which is right to the west of the eruption site. And there we can see there's a clear gain in elevation from 2 months ago. We can measure that at, looks like this was maybe at around 2 centimeters. And now we're up around 22, we could say. So maybe 20 centimeters of gain in this one area. And it's hard to say exactly how this went. It could have gone way higher and then come down and be going up again. We don't have that. It's probably not quite that high, but yeah, it could have gone up a little bit and then come down and be doing something. We really don't know. But we do know that it's on net more swollen there than it was before. And likewise at the MMAU station, just south of that area, it's also bulged upwards there. And if you notice, these two data points are spread apart, right? These are not plotting one on top of the other. Like this could still be moving. Hard to see exactly which direction it's moving, but could still be moving in that area even now. And that could be where all that slow trickle of magma is going into the rift. Further over at Nāpau, we're also up quite a bit, but here it looks like we're more stable. These two circles are right on top of each other. So even though the lava came out of the ground at the surface near Nāpau, it's actually building up further on the ground to the west, closer to Mauna Ulu, which is why we see the signals playing out that way. And so similar pattern here, KERZ, maybe a little bit more movement happening near the eruption site. But we go further over to Kamomoa. This is now east of the eruption site. And there is still an increase in net gain in elevation, but not nearly as much as what we saw just to the west. And coming over to the Okita station, similarly, a little bit of gain, not as much as we saw further west. At Puʻuʻōʻō, same thing, even less of an increase. And the station that we use, Jacuzzi, for our distance measurement is the one that actually does not have any data coming in over the last couple of days. Still offline, which is why our distance measurement did not register any data. So that's really the story here. I can keep going further east, but we really lose the effect. RKAR, hardly anything visible here, maybe slightly up, but within the noise, really can't tell anything with any confidence whatsoever. And no data coming in further over at R931. So that is it. We have a little bit of GPS update. You can see that everything further down the rift, Jonica, Nanavale's got no data, but Jonica is looking right on trend as well. So otherwise, the pattern, we can't see what we miss in between, but we can see the trend still continue. The south flank stations, what I'm really curious with those is this middle panel, the north-south component. How fast is it moving south? Right, you can see that, for example, at Idaho, this is a little bit further west by the southwest rift. When we're having southwest rift intrusions and eruptions, it was moving south really fast, and then it kind of resumed a more reasonable, we'll call it, southward march, speed up again, and it looks like it maybe is on that more steady southward march once again. It's not speeding up. It has to be in a slower trend here. It's definitely not in one of these, right? So it's moving south steadily, we'll call it. Coming further east to Mulivaioapile, it's moving more quickly, I would say. It looks like a steeper line there. Maybe not quite as steep as this, but it's certainly steeper than that. So still a good amount of south flank movement happening. And we see that with the earthquakes as well. And continuing across, Makai, this is very close to the eruption site, so this is all distorted out of whack. We'll just pass that one over for now. So it's Kalapana Trail, very near the eruption site. Those got shoved really far south as a result of the eruption. So what we can't tell here is that likely there was a drop, and what we don't know is, did it stabilize at a flat rate, or did it stabilize at a steep rate there? We just don't know what's happening with not enough data yet. Everything else is within the regular pattern. You can still see here a lot of movement south at Holeipale, at MP3R. This is the one south of Puʻuʻōʻō. When we go further over to the coast, not quite as drastic, but still ongoing there. Our southwest rift, in contrast, is down and down. And our southwest flank, over by the southwest rift, is more in line with its previous pattern, if anything, maybe even slowed somewhat there on the southwest side with this shift to the east rift zone here. So that's our GPS dive for the day, and that wraps up our monitoring. And we will wrap up our first half here by coming to look at the Volcano Watch for this week, which is looking at where do we go from here? What are some potential long-term outcomes of our recent intrusions on Kilauea's east rift zone? So this is exploring some less likely possibilities of what might happen, but it is showing, just talking about the processes that occur on a volcano, which is educational and worth going into as well. So they have here a satellite image of the volcano today with the road, the Chain of Craters Road in a national park from before 1969 superimposed upon here. So you can see the previous craters, including some that have been completely filled with lava and are now buried. Those two and this inner one over here as well. And other ones that are still persisting but have also had lava flows within them within the last 50 plus years. So a lot of change in those days, as we mentioned before, through our whole series of the East Rift. The Chain of Craters Road goes all the way to Makapui before heading south towards Kalapana. And now the Chain of Craters Road goes off over here because all of this was all covered in lava, all of it. So a lot of changes on a volcano's landscape here. And this does bring up in this article the fact that there are a whole bunch of pit craters up here on this part of the rift zone. So let's go through this a little bit. They talk about lava flows occur in this area. Many flows go south towards the coast because of the big pali, but also many can be trapped within the craters, like what happened at Nāpau last month. So all those craters on a chain of craters are pit craters, which form solely by collapse of the ground surface without an accompanying eruption at the site. They note that probably all the pit craters are younger than the 15th century. And in fact, I've heard in detail that most likely, maybe not, a runaway solution here, but most likely when we had the major caldera collapse at the summit of Kilauea, that caused collapse along the entire magma system, which includes the East Rift and those pit craters as well. So maybe those all happened at the same time. In any case, they were a while ago. Most of them, not all of them. We'll get to that in a few minutes here, but before the year 1900, there were 16 pit craters between Luamanu and Nāpau. Some of those have coalesced, so there are more craters than there are names. For example, Hiaka has 2 craters. Pauahi has 3 craters. This crater is gone, but Alai had 2, and Makapuhi had 2, one of which is gone. They note that another one formed around 1900. That was the one we now call Devil's Throat. If you hadn't guessed, the only one with a Christian and not a Hawaiian name here in the modern record. So they note the eruptions in the 60s and 80s that filled 7 craters partially. There they are. Or completely. Those 3 completely. And that's largely because of the eruption of Mauna Ulu that lasted 5 years in this area of the rift zone. Okay, so there's a couple of things here and then where this goes. There's a paragraph here that I will skip for now and come back to because I will take this down a rabbit hole, not too deep, but a little bit. We'll skip to the recent intrusions could have 3 very different outcomes. Repeated intrusions could spawn eruptions that could bypass the craters completely, or they could partially or completely fill one or more of the craters. So intrusions, eruptions that fill craters or flow downhill. Another option is that underground draining of one of the intrusions could lead to formation of a new pit crater. Now, I'll just note here that if the lava is draining, it has to be going somewhere. So if lava is going somewhere, then we're back in option number 1, actually, because we're almost back to intrusion. Is it going to erupt somewhere else? And along with that, you might add the 1B. It could leave a pit crater behind where it came from. So, but that is a possibility. Not very likely, but it's listed here. They do note that one or more eruptions seem far more likely, like the recent one. But collapse to form a new pit crater happened at least 17 times in the last 550 years. And so just statistically, it's not such a rare occurrence there. And we're going to dig into this pit crater thing a little bit here. They do note another potential effect that could accompany continued intrusions in the East Rift is earthquakes beneath the south flank. We talked about this forever. We talk about this all the time. We don't stop talking about this. But here they're bringing it up again, that the volcano is always in a constant state of balance between extension of the south flank due to pressure from the volcano and intrusion in the magma of the rift zone. And at times, that flank can become loaded like a spring, and even the small force of an intrusion can trigger more earthquakes. And the south flank has generated several big earthquakes. The largest one on this area was in 75, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake. That created a tsunami that killed 2 campers and many horses at Halape, as the south flank moved several meters south and down. The whole coconut grove at Halape was submerged and is underwater now in the bay. So while it's not known exactly what caused that earthquake, it did follow 15 years of intrusions along that chain of craters. So it could well be linked that injection of magma caused more slippage. So all in all, we're curious to see what we can learn from what's happening now. They note all of these extreme scenarios, a new pit crater, massive seaward movement of the south flank, are all less likely than one or more eruptions. So more monitoring and understanding all the options, even if they're less likely, are good for our planning. So there are no facts about the future, is how they end this. So that is the Volcano Watch for this week. And I do want to come back to this one paragraph right here, which is the one that I maybe object to a little bit, and I'll pull on the string a little bit just for discussion. They say the chain of craters is the only section of the East Rift Zone and its submarine extension, the Puna Ridge, that contains pit craters. This relates to this probably relates to the proximity to the summit, and more intrusions near the summit could lead to more draining events. And they believe, or they state here, such intrusions, the infrequent lateral draining of such intrusions is a likely explanation of how pit craters form. Hey, Dana, I hear your frogs.
Yeah. I was just, is Chain of Craters considered Leilani Estates in the back of it?
No,
that's a
Chain of Craters is in the park.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can take you to some that are out there over here.
Well, we can discuss this.
Yeah.
We can discuss this, right? Because it comes down to how you're going to define these things, right? Because what it really comes down to is it's got to be mostly collapse without accompanying eruption at the site. All right. So since you want to talk about Leilani, let's bring up Leilani on Google Earth. Here's Leilani, and in particular, the ones that are the most famous, which were on the radar during 2018 eruption, are Puʻuʻōʻō crater and Hawaii crater right over here, right? These are huge craters. They're more than 300 feet deep. Certainly a large amount of collapse has happened here. Yeah, we can go to some literature such as this paper, which I'll show you the title in a minute here, but it does say things like that there were, at Puʻuʻōʻō crater, many large steam explosions that occurred. So does that count as an eruption? It says there was tuff as thick as 20 meters deposited during these violent steam explosions. So it's leaving deposits out further downfield. So in that case, maybe it's an eruption. And if so, does it not count as a pit crater? I don't know, because I would say that it's a separate thing, because after the eruption happens, that's when you have the collapse. And the collapse is happening just like everywhere else from material being removed and a top falling in. In this case, it's still 300 feet thick. You can't get in there without ropes. Yeah, or not without keeping your life, right? I mean, that's one of the areas where they believe that the Noddies, I forget the name of the bird, the rare Hawaiian birds are nesting in a cliffs there. I believe that they're, yeah. So great place for them to stay safe because people can't get to them. But even in here, it does say here, collapse near the end of the explosions formed the 3 largest pit craters, including Puʻuʻōʻō crater on the lower East Rift Zone. So at least in some of the literature, they're clearly calling that a pit crater. And so this is why I say it really depends on your terminology here.
I mean, this is just the first I've learned that there's a possibility those aren't considered pit craters in Leilani. This is the first I'm hearing of this. So I'm kind of like, wait, what?
Yeah. Yeah, because, some of the ones, the original definition as was put forth was it's like something you're walking up to and you don't even see the hole in the ground. There's nothing on the rim at all, just nothing. It's just a pit, right? No surface expression whatsoever. So once it starts leaving stuff behind, now you start getting into, okay, like, is it actually a vent that collapsed? Okay, there's some gray zone there, right? And maybe that's where they are like drawing a hard line. No, it's not a pit crater because there was a vent there that collapsed. Okay, well, that's one interpretation for sure, right? That's why we're discussing this. But you can see that even in a bulletin of volcanology, Dick Moore from the USGS is calling those pit craters. Right, this is one example of that. Now, there is another example, which I'm going to jump to right here, which is actually, let's pull up the map again. All right, let's zoom out a little bit from Leilani. Let's pan a little bit further west to the site of the 55 eruption. And right in here, or a little known, there is a pit crater here as well. That pit crater is called, let's get it for you here, Lua Ni'i pit crater. McDonald and Eaton observed Lua Ni'i as it broke the ground surface on March 20th, 1955, when a 9-meter section of roof collapsed into a larger underground void. It began as a fissure vent that had ceased erupting 1 week previous to the pit developing. The opening of the pit was announced by a sharp explosion and a small puff of black dust. No rock was ever erupted or ejected from the pit, although the fissure itself continued to fume and retained enough heat from the previous week's eruption to remelt the pit's wall rock. They get in an airplane the next day, fly over, estimate the surface opening to be 20 feet in diameter, with a depth of up to 75 feet, floored with brightly glowing material. The pit increased downwards in diameter, with the walls overhanging 15 to 20 feet on all sides, except on the fissure side to the southwest, where it went back at least 50 feet beyond the rim. So there's another one that you could argue is actually a pit crater, right? And this paper is actually, let's see if I can get the slider here, pit crater formation on Kilauea volcano, Hawaii. So it's actually calling out that lower East Rift one. And this paper does not call Puʻuʻōʻō crater a pit crater, right? So you can see that even within some literature, they go either way, right? But here is a map on Kilauea, Luani'i. Most of the craters that they talk about, the chain of craters, are right here. So they are actually a good number of them. They are the largest ones, in fact, are all in this one area. But we also know there's a lot of south flank movement here because the rift zone is all bent that way compared to the southwest rift, which also has a ton of pit craters. Some over here, some over here, a whole bunch by the Great Crack. And in fact, the Great Crack in some places could be considered to be a string of all of fully connected pit craters. They call it a pit trough through this area, right? Like a valley just of all pits connected. So not quite fair to say that the chain of craters in the Upper East Rift is the only craters on the East Rift, right? But lots of pit craters all around. And so this is a study that came through and looked at lots of details of how pit craters formed. And I will not read you tons and tons of details, but here are some observations they pull out. There are often ground cracks that occur on both sides. They often call these bounding faults. So craters often form in the areas between two cracks. Right? So there is Luamanu, Pauahi. There's between those two cracks. There's between those two cracks. Right? Between those two cracks. Puʻuʻōʻō, this is the one just southwest of Nāpau. Nāpau itself. Puhimau, you see this pretty common that you have cracks bounding the pit craters there. Devil's Throat was also the other pit crater that was seen to have opened. It's believed to have opened around 1900. Jagger surveyed it in 1912, noting that it had about a 15-meter opening with a depth of 76 meters. At the bottom of the void, he noted a cave within the northwest wall, and that's another feature that I find commonly in pit craters. There's a cave somewhere that aligns with these cracks on the edges. So it was surveyed again 11 years later, measured a depth of 78 meters. And then it came back, it was remeasured once again. Let's see here. Where is it? Oh, here. Present day observations, remeasured once again. And where is it here? Big crater southwest rift zone. No, I can't find it. Well, I will find that at some point, but what you find after it was remeasured, after I want to say it was a couple of decades, here it is. Oh no, February 1998. Devil's Throat is nearly cylindrical. The diameter is now 48 meters as opposed to 50 meters. And the depth is 50 meters instead of 76. So the top edges have fallen in and filled in the bottom, buried the cave, so the cave is no longer visible at the bottom of Devil's Throat. And that's how these pit craters are seen to grow, from the bottom up, actually, right? They actually noted the hole forming the surface and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the depth getting shallower and shallower and shallower as all that stuff fell into it. So that's another piece of the puzzle of how these things form. So there's Devil's Throat between two crack zones. I'll keep it moving a little more quickly here. They do a lot of models, and they want to explain the locations of the pits on the rift zones, the abundance of the cracks in the pit walls, how there are bounding faults, how they're elliptical, how the walls are really steep and overhanging and fall in over time, and how there are caves within them. So I'll jump to their model right here and try to explain what is going on. So what they're noting here is there is a chunk of Earth, right? That's in 3 dimensions, this cube right here. And within this cube, you have a crack that's forming. Here's the top of the crack, and the crack is moving in this direction. Now within this area of land, you have a weakness, somewhere that does not have as much strength in the rock as everywhere around it. So what happens when that crack reaches that zone is able to crack upwards because the rock's not as strong right there, and then keeps going beyond that. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is when you have a crack that's further down, it creates a series of two parallel cracks in the surface that are fairly far apart. And as that crack comes shallower, those surface cracks come closer and closer together, right? So what eventually happens is as that crack continues moving past there and has already moved past this area of weakness, it can then crack upwards within this weak zone, which has got now cracks going up and down, or a weak zone that's vertical, along with two weak zones that are very close at the surface that are also at 90 degrees to that. So now you can start collapsing your pit crater basically from below, like a chimney that opens up and starts falling into that crack from below. So you can accomplish all of this without any magma moving at all. But if you happen to have magma within this crack further down, then you can also get rid of some of the stuff that's falling in and make even more space. You can also wedge open this crack even further so that there's more space for the stuff to fall in and the crater gets bigger. So those are how it all fits together here. And that's the overall model of how the pit craters form. Right? It's more to do with how the cracks intersect each other. And yes, you have to have the material moving out of the area. And that material moving maybe is what's causing these cracks. And so it's really when things are really active and dynamic that we expect the pit crater to form. It's not going to come up out of the blue where nothing has happened in an area for years, right? Even down in the Lower East Rift had been the week before, it was just erupting, and then it collapsed after that. So that gives you some context of how these things form. So that's it. I'll pull us out of the rabbit hole here and just very quickly bounce us to check in on Mauna Loa, which does not have a whole lot of change. The summit tilt is showing some interesting wiggles, but all within the expected range that it could be part of the cycles of the tides, Earth and other tides. So earthquakes are still pretty low. No deep ones over the last week here. Earthquake rates are down. And really, here's a story, very little happening in Mauna Loa. It's back to its background state, essentially, as it refills following that 2022 eruption. So that's it. I will pass it to Luke here for our community corner, and then we'll do our questions after our thank yous.
All right, so let's go ahead and get Lou in here. We'll see you again, Phil, here in a moment. Hey, Lou. Hey, good evening. So, what do you got for us in the community corner? Well, this week we were busy. We were up at Mountain View Elementary School, the three of us. Brought our volcano toolkit up there. You can see the kids in the photo there, showing them viscosity. That's how we started off our week. Let's see what's going on up at the park. There's a photo I pulled over the moon over Volcano House, NPS photo from Janice Way. We are in a big supermoon, aren't we, right now? And got the comet, a bunch of stuff in the sky. The comet. Mm-hmm. The alerts and conditions. Photos of that kind of stuff. Check out Hawaii Tracker. It is full of them right now. The park conditions and alerts going on at the park. Nāpau Crater and campground still closed. They are inundated with lava and remain closed until further notice. Construction was happening up there. Dana and I took a drive up to the park yesterday, and excavators and dump trucks and guys working everywhere. Helicopter operations continue on the Makapui fire. Phil did mention that fires were out. I just checked this alerts and conditions page with the park, and this is all still on their page as of 5 minutes ago. So be on the lookout. But firefighters and helicopters continue suppression efforts on the Makapui fire. Mauna parking lot and associated trails are open. Stay clear of helicopter operations. There's a shot I took as we were heading in. You can see the construction on the far right and the far left, what they've been doing to expand the lanes and improve the traffic flow going in. Both lanes were open and they were green. And that takes us down to Kahuku. After dark in the park is not going on in the park up top, but down at the Kahuku, there is another encore presentation of living history play, Nani o Kahuku. We've live streamed, we filmed one and we live streamed one of these. It's a great presentation. If you have a chance, go down there and check it out. It's a one-woman living history play adapted by Jackie Puʻuʻōʻō Johnson from the diary of Hannah Pialani Jones. That's Saturday, October 19th. And Kahuku Unit Visitor Station is located near Ka'u, near the 70.5 mile marker off Highway 11. And since you're down there, I wanted to pull some pictures because if you like to hike, it is a beautiful place to hike. It's completely different than hiking up top of the park because it's just rolling hills down there. You can see the rolling hills in the back. Some more NPS photos. And pack a lunch. There's some picnic tables out there. There's trees everywhere to sit under and have lunch. It's a beautiful spot. So check that out in their presentation. Now we have food. Experience authentic Hawaiian culture. Imu Mea'ai and Menapa present Emu Building Workshop. That's happening tomorrow, October 18th. It's interactive emu cooking, poi pounding, makahiki games, kapuna storytelling. Check that out. If you missed tomorrow, there is some other dates I have listed on there. Arrive on time if you want to participate in Emu Building. That's from 11 a.m. till 3 p.m. in Pahoa. And I've been revving this up for the last couple weeks, so hopefully you have your pets ready. Dogs must be on a leash. Cats must be in a carrier. Haka's letting me know to put this out to you guys to make sure that you know to be ready and get your pets ready. And we'll be registering and scanning microchips. You can see the fee there is $2.10 for sterile, $6.10 for non-sterile. That's happening at the Cooper Center in Volcano, Saturday, October 19th from 8 to 12:30. The Pacific Tsunami Museum, this was a pretty cool thing that they did. Keiki 17 under will receive free admission for the rest of the 24-25 school year. Like I said last week, I know you're excited about that, Dane. You should be good. And that brings us to our survey. Dane, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So we did the survey last year, and it's our way of trying to get some data on how impactful this stream has been and the information that we put out across social media in written form, as well as in live stream and video. So if you could jump on and consider filling that out. Again, you do not need to be here in Hawaii to fill this one out. We're trying to get a survey on how everybody's doing and their scope of knowledge, and just seeing this is our best way, one of the best ways you can help us out outside of the other ways that I'm about to mention here to support us. This is a great way to support us, is taking our summary or survey. They should not take more than 5 minutes, and we can go ahead and get that link for the chat too. We should
we'll drop that in there. Mm-hmm.
There's also one other event. You can talk for a second, Lou, and I will try and get this up.
I'm looking. Just the 2024 Big Island Art Summit and Showcase happening. Let's see if I can get this up here. Can you get that up on the screen for me, Dane?
I'm trying to. Just give me some time. So go ahead and just talk about something.
Yep.
Don't care.
Over there. I didn't see it. In conjunction with the Natural Energy Laboratory of Hawaii Authority, 50th anniversary, Hawaii Keiki Museum is excited to be the organizer for the 2024 Big Island Art Summit this Saturday. This landmark event brings together artists, educators, community leaders, and the public to celebrate the vibrant arts community and the interconnectedness of Art, Science, and Education on Hawaii Island. That is Saturday, October 19th. Nelha's Malka Research Campus, 9:30 a.m. to 3 p.m. But if you just can't wait, consider joining us for the preview night on Friday, October 18th, 5 to 7 p.m. Suggested dress code: wear anything locally made. All right. Bring your favorite magnet to contribute to the interactive magnet wall. Right on. So that is happening on the Kona side.
All right, looks good. And I think that gets us through the community corner.
Bill, were you trying to jump in there with something?
What? I was posting this thing. The big, isn't that what you were talking about? Sorry.
Yeah, I can't hear Phil. Looked like he was saying something.
Oh.
Yeah, if you can hear me on there, there's a whole bunch of performances on there. Like you can see John Kiawe's on there, like high school bands on there, taiko drums are on there. It's like there's that first most of the day is there's reggae, dance theater. It's like a great thing if you're in a wet side over there at the Keiki Museum. Keiki Museum's helping putting it on with Nelha being the host. Yeah, so, yeah.
Right on. Thanks.
All right.
All right.
And I believe that gets us through the community corner.
I do have one more thing to add on here.
All right.
Yeah. There we go. If you are looking for where we post our articles or videos, you can find us at www.hveri.org/follow. That has all of the links to all the different platforms. I know everybody uses everything differently. We kind of spread it out just in case you use one over the other. So you can check us out at hveri.org/follow to get those links there. And I will drop the link in the survey if you want to.
Yeah, go ahead and do that.
Yep.
Those survey links shared out, and we'll move over into go ahead and thanking everybody.
Yep, I'm going to roll mid-roll.
All right. So, yeah, we'd like to thank everybody that tuned in today. The likes, subscriptions, the shares, all that stuff does really help. Also, we'd like to thank those that have donated to us, through the super chats, but we encourage people to donate over on our website at hveri.org/donate. Those are tax-deductible donations because we are a 501c community-based organization, so tax-deductible. And yeah, appreciate all of our partners out there, and look forward to moving forward on that and everything we're doing there. All right, Lou.
All right, I got the survey up, and I'm going to go ahead and pin it in the top of the chat.
Perfect. And let's make sure we get that over on Facebook as well.
Yep.
And everywhere. All right, cool. So I believe that gets us through, Lou, and we will go back for some questions with Phil. I believe we have a couple at least here.
Thank you much.
All right, thanks, Lou. All right, Phil, welcome back. Let me go ahead and roll some background imagery so we can talk some questions and stuff here. Don't have that much, really. The first one was from Buster Brown, who asked that, is that essentially a graben, the crack and the surface features illustration you were going through when we were talking pit craters?
It's pretty close. Normally a graben, you'd imagine having the two faults coming in towards each other a little bit. And in that area being pulled apart, nothing to fall in. And the description I have is some of these pit crater faults are upwards of 87 degrees, like almost 90. So yeah, kind of. It's a similar process if you don't get technical about what you call it and the angles, but yeah, it's basically that. When the faults kind of come close to each other, they start feeling each other, right? Because there's pressure that is in the rock that the crack is moving through, and so it's going to move in the area where the pressure is the least. So whatever's around it affects that rock, right? So it can feel a neighboring crack relieving pressure, and they can kind of try to find each other that way. So it's a little bit similar, but not exactly, without getting too technical about it.
All right. So other one's kind of an observation. It's from Yvonne over on Facebook. It says that a massive chunk of Devil's Throat fell in during the recent intrusion. So it's definitely wider. It's also saying that there's other pieces there that have become very loose, and all it's going to take is one good shake to put them inside the crater as well. So interesting to see it change time with these continued events.
Yeah, we always appreciate those first-hand reports. Yeah, for sure. So slightly wider and probably slightly shallower. Quite a few rocks.
All right, and I will do one last check just to make sure I haven't missed anything while we've been talking here. And yeah, I think we're all right for the question section. Appreciate it, everybody. Yeah.
Right. Well, then we'll turn to our volcano awareness presentation this week, which is focused on earthquake awareness. And I know we've been going for a while, so I'll try to summarize as much as I can here. And we'll start off today with last week's Volcano Watch, which is on the 2024 Great Hawaii Shakeout, which was today. And what this is a earthquake preparedness drill that happens every October, the third Thursday of October. So since it's 10:17 today, the drill happened at 10:17 a.m. And the mantra for the Great Shakeout is drop, cover, and hold on. So that is the action to take in response. And there's a few interesting things to highlight. One is just a cultural insertion, which I appreciate here, from the HVO seismologist who wrote this article. And he notes that in his younger days, they would hear melodic chimes slowly moving through the neighborhood. And maybe some of you have a similar experience, but here's where the cultural twist comes in. That sweet sound signaled that the Manapua truck was coming by. As kids, we would hear that sound and run outside to look, all while yelling to the neighbors that the Manapua man is coming. So I'll leave that for you guys to explore further if you're interested in digging into Hawaiian culture a little bit here. But apart from the Great Shakeout, drop, cover, hold on, the interesting thing that's in this article is noting that there are 2 earthquake early warning systems that are now being used. They don't warn you super far in advance, but it's a start. The first is Shake Alert, which is a collaboration led by the USGS and a whole bunch of people, which began in California in 2019 and expanded to Oregon and Washington in 2021. And so that currently is where the USGS can send out those Shake Alert, right? And so they might detect something a few seconds to a few minutes ahead of an earthquake, and it comes out like that, and they tell you it's coming within a few seconds or within a minute, and that helps. The second one is Google, who is also part of the consortium, announced just last month that they will roll out the Android earthquake alerts system for the rest of the country, 47 states and 5 US territories. However, the Google version is 1, only for Android devices, 2, proprietary, and 3, not tied to the government. And so we'll talk about more of this in the future, but just to note that this is going to be rolling out here. So that's the topic this year. Their article is going back many years. I'll just pull up the one from last year, just to bring us some continuity. And so last year's, they were talking about what they call the earthquake budget. So we feel the ground shaking from earthquakes, and that's certainly a release of the energy. But it's not the only way that earthquakes release energy. One of the other ways they release that is by breaking the actual rocks, mechanical energy that actually can happen. It can cause the rocks to slide past each other and actually heat up. So it creates heat as energy as well. Occasionally, very, very rarely, you hear reports of maybe like flashes of light or sounds as well. So other ways that energy can be released through these earthquakes. However, most of the energy affects most people is the radiated energy that comes through the ground. Right? So, but that is one thing that is a potential difference between 2 earthquakes that might happen in a very similar location with very similar size. They can be felt very differently at the surface, might be because the energy gets split differently between what gets sent out to shake people and what gets sent out to heat the rock and what gets sent out to break rock, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a little bit more into where the earthquake energy is actually going. And so I'll leave that article at that as well. And we'll come back to this eventually, but to start off, we're going to review the 3 kinds of earthquakes in Hawaii. We are most familiar with our volcanic magmatic earthquakes, when we have lots of earthquakes in bunches that occur, fairly shallow. Those earthquakes track the movement of the dike. They can be caused by rock breaking at the front of the dike. And you can also have this harmonic tremor that's vibrations of moving gas or fluids within the conduit. That's our volcanic bucket. We have what I often call our flank earthquakes. Here they're calling them edifice or tectonic earthquakes, but they're the flank earthquakes, when the side of the volcano is moving along the base of the ocean floor, right? And the last bucket would be what I often call the settling earthquakes, flexural or mantle earthquakes, where you see that under Hawaii with the largest pile of volcanic mass today, you have the greatest downward bending of the ocean tectonic plate, and that creates stresses as the plate is being flexed, and those can cause earthquakes as well, right? So continually, it's essentially always on a curve, so that can happen anywhere along the entire volcano, except perhaps at the very, very center in the middle underneath it. Right? So those are the 3 kinds of earthquakes there. To go into slightly more depth, we had a Volcano Watch back in 2021 that talked about how the volcanoes are really heavy and how these flexural earthquakes can actually become quite large. They noted at that point in time in 2021, there had been a 5.2 and a 4.2 on the north side of the island, but there can be much larger earthquakes than that. Some additional past Hawaiian flexure earthquakes include in Lanai, a 6.8 in 1871, on Maui, a 6.8 in 1938, on Oahu, a 5.2 in 1948. Imagine a 5.2 now on Oahu, all those extra buildings. 6.2 Honolulu in 73, and most recently, 6.7 Kīlauea Bay, 6.1 Mahukona on the west side, and a 4.6 under Ocean View in 2019. So they can get quite big. What's actually happening? What do we mean by the weight? So here's what they say. As volcanoes erupt and grow, they add more and more weight to the Earth's surface. That causes the plate to flex downwards, much like bending caused by heavy books on an overloaded bookshelf. Like that. Some weight may just make the shelf bow, but a lot of weight may cause a shelf to start to splinter or break. Those breaks are similar to what happens in tectonic plates if they bend too much. So those are our settling, bending earthquakes. We have discussed in the past, a paper by Klein in 2015, that where these earthquakes are bending down, where the earthquakes bend down and where they intersect the magma pathways of the volcano, you can get extra earthquakes as well. So that is also a thing we'll just bring up just to remind you here today. So we've done the volcanic ones we're more familiar with. The settling ones are there. We also can talk about this less than a year ago, Volcano Watch from December 2023. We're all within 1 week. We had a whole bunch of different kinds of earthquakes that occurred. So we can see that earthquake risk is greatest on the south side of Hawaii Island, on Hawaii Island next, and then next including Maui as well, but it actually extends all the way to Oahu as well, beyond Kauai too. So during that 1 week, they had flank earthquakes. We had intrusion in the southwest rift, volcanic earthquakes, and we also had the settling earthquakes. So just to show how all was going to be happening all at the same time. So that is the summary of what I want to set up. What I want to do next and last is to bring up an interview we did 5 years ago with Dr. Brian Shiro from the USGS, who goes into several things that are worth recapping with you guys today. Some of the other nuances of Hawaii Island, in particular the Pahala earthquakes, a little bit more about our South Flank earthquakes as well, and then what little details, nuances, what you actually can do, why drop, cover, and hold on, right? And what beyond that, how much more can we get out of that? So I will put Brian up here on stage next, and myself 5 years younger, and we'll let that roll here for the next 25 minutes. All right, ready? Welcome, everybody. We're here with Brian Shiro today, a geophysicist at HVO, specializing in seismology. We've been there for 3 years, since 2016.
Yeah.
And you're here to share with us today some of the current activity on our volcanoes on the island.
That's right. Let's talk about earthquakes.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, the southwest part of Mauna Loa is right up against Kilauea. One of the common areas of seismicity between those volcanoes is underneath Pahala.
The area around Pahala, sometimes we call it the deep lower southwest rift of Kilauea, is a zone that has very deep seismicity occurring between 30 to 40 plus kilometers down.
That's a long way down.
Yeah, and it's as long as we've been monitoring earthquakes on the island, we've been seeing them there. In fact, some of the earliest observations of harmonic tremor that were characterized in the literature came from this area as well, going back some 40, 50 years. And yeah, so the area, you can see it circled there, is what we're talking about. It starts near the town of Pahala and also goes offshore quite a bit. But this is distinct from Loihi. So Loihi is even more to the south. So we can tell the earthquakes here versus Loihi earthquakes.
You mentioned harmonic tremor. Could you explain to our audience a little bit more about what harmonic tremor is and how it's different from other earthquakes?
Sure. So a normal earthquake that we experience most commonly is due to slip along a fault. So you have some stress building up, you have a crack underground that develops, and then the stress can't be supported by that rock anymore, and it moves. So it's this brittle failure. Basically, you're breaking the rock. Harmonic tremor and other types of volcanic seismicity are due to fluid movement. So in the case of tremor, it means that the fluid is resonating inside some kind of crack or conduit underground. And depending on the size of that conduit and the characteristics of that fluid and what's driving that, how much water is there, whether it's water or magma or what have you, or gases, the period will be different. So that the way that fluctuates. And so here's an image here showing some examples of volcanic seismicity, which you can see the waveforms or the wiggles on the page here look a little different, but they're all due to resonance of fluids underground in some way. So LP stands for long period. That's the type of seismicity we see under the volcanoes. Then you have tremor, which can be deep or shallow. And there's an example of deep tremor under the Southwest Rift region that we were talking about. And there's a comparison to a deep earthquake at the bottom, which is right here, which is has more of what we call impulsive or sharp onset. And you can see S waves as well, whereas you don't see that with tremor. With tremor, it just starts gradually. You can see it has a cigar shape here as well. Sometimes that's the characteristic shape, and it fades back down.
Oh, fantastic. And I've looked at the online maps that you guys have, and sometimes you actually can see the difference in how these things are plotted.
Yeah, so online, when we post the earthquakes online, we can give it a type as a category we tag for the earthquakes, and so we can tag them as earthquakes or as LP, a long period events, or as tremor events. And depending on that, it may show up as a different symbol. And if you click them, you can find the waveform or the actual data, and you can, of course, see this yourself in the data.
Try to match one of these patterns that you see here with what's online.
Yeah.
Awesome. So this is an area that has lots of different kinds of earthquakes.
Yeah. What we're looking at here is a map from a publication that came out in 2015, which explored earthquakes in this area of different types, and basically ran a sophisticated computer algorithm through the continuous data and found many different types of earthquakes. And so what we're looking at here is, you can see they circled some zones. The red zone here is where some of the deeper tremor is happening, and then plotted on top of that, you can see it on the right side, are are earthquakes themselves. And then they identified another zone up here in the north and talked about how this might connect up to Kilauea. The interpretation from this and other papers is that there's potentially an area of melt down there where perhaps a hot spot comes underneath Hawaii, heats up the rock down there, creates some kind of partial melt, and through some mechanism feeds the volcanoes, Kilauea, Mauna Loa, and Loihi potentially. And so in that zone there's going to be some fluid and some cracks, and it's going to resonate from time to time and make the tremor. But it also breaks the rock, so we get earthquakes as well, perhaps on the edges of that. The top is where we've interpreted it mostly, but it could be anywhere on the edges, and that's creating the brittle failure or the breaking that leads to earthquakes as well. And in fact, if you look over on this other screen, if you can switch it, this screen is showing that same zone, and the earthquakes now are colored different. They're blue and purple, and that means they're deep. And it's the same colors that are on the HVO website, by the way. And you can see where they cluster quite densely onshore, but also offshore. And these are, for the most part, actual earthquakes due to breaking of the rock. There is tremor that is mixed in there sometimes, but they tend to be discrete events that happen for minutes to hours, and then they're over, and they happen somewhat sporadically, not too often. But that's the right side of this figure here. On the left side, it's a pretty interesting plot too. The top one shows,
Here's your finger.
Look at my finger. Oh yeah, low tech here. So there we go. So if you go 50 years back in time, this is 1970 to now. This is showing the number of earthquakes per year. So you can see these small little blue blip here in 1970, 100 earthquakes per year or so. Pretty low levels for a long time. Started to pick up in the 2000s, and then there was quite a big swarm in 2005, big for the time, which tailed off a little bit, but really heralded, I think, an increase in this seismicity in this region, because you can see it started to ramp up, and then an even larger swarm happened in 15, which has led to this situation we're in today. It's kept us busy analyzing all these earthquakes, so it's multiplied the workload quite a bit for us.
So that bottom plot on the left is actually blown up.
Yes.
From the top one, yeah.
Correct. The blown up plot on the bottom is zooming in on the last 5 years. And you can see that swarm that happened in October of 15, and then other increases and decreases have happened since then, and then a really dramatic increase recently in 2019, which is where we are right now.
And then the upper plot goes all the way back to 1970, is that correct?
Yes.
And so is it only because of the change in our measuring of the earthquakes that we see such a big increase recent time, or is there something else going on?
That's a valid question. So we have better instruments now, we have more instruments now, we can detect more than we could in the past, and there probably is some of that bias going on, but the major upgrade that happened to HVO's instrumentation happened around 2011 or so. And so if that were the main culprit, I would expect to see a big jump around 2011, and you really just don't see that. Also, when I made these plots, I filtered out the smallest earthquakes. So really the more modern instrumentation allows us to see the smaller and smaller seismicity. The big stuff we could see anyway, even with the old instruments. So this is, I think, is a real effect.
Awesome, that's really fascinating. Yeah. And we talked about fluid moving through here. Presumably some of that fluid is the magma itself. Where is it going from here? Do we know?
We don't know for sure. There are some authors, Klein, Wright, Koyanagi, and others in the past have looked at this, and they've looked at trends that show the seismicity tracing out a path perhaps toward the Kilauea summit. It's tenuous way it may move through the Southwest Rift region, but there is some suggestion that it does go there. And then there's also some suggestion that it may go to Mauna Loa as well. So they've looked at that and seen some shallowing in the depths of the earthquakes toward Mauna Loa. But quickly, the view gets obscured. We don't know what's in between. You can't connect the dots, but it makes sense that perhaps it's connected to both.
Right, that's really fascinating. So it could be going possibly either way or both at the same time.
Possibly.
And we just have to wait and see what we see, right?
Right, and there's a lot of open questions because geochemically speaking, the rocks that come out of Kilauea and the rocks that come out of Mauna Loa are different. There's some isotopic signatures in those rocks that that tell you that the source magma is different for them. So if this indeed were a single source, well, how does that happen? What happens to the magma on the way to change it?
Great. Really interesting questions there.
Yeah.
So when we look at this plot, I mean, we're showing like this blob area, and these earthquakes are more or less at the same depth. Does this mean that this is kind of a flattish area that the magma is moving through? Do we know anything about that, or is it just too hard to tell?
Well, this one paper here from where this figure came is actually plot some of those out. They do a relocation on them, and they notice that it does form a flat, almost like a table-like feature which goes toward the east, pointing towards Kilauea. And so the interpretation was there may be some zone of weakness there that allows this activity to go along that trend. So that's about all we know. It's deep. It's hard to measure. The fact that it's on the coast and offshore as well makes it doubly hard to measure, because we don't have ocean bottom seismometers, sadly. So we can't surround it with our instruments like you should do to locate them well.
To get the best accuracy, right?
That's right.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. So one question that we often get is, why are there earthquakes between Pahala and the summit when we see this pattern there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We don't know. This is why it's fun to be in science, because you're a detective figuring things out, and we just don't know. There have been times, of course, in the past when the Southwest Rift, the shallower region, the Southwest Rift have been more active. It's erupted, of course, in recent decades, in 1974, for example. But how that connects down to this region is a mystery, really.
Maybe is it fair to say that the conduit of magma to Kilauea is not the pipe that many people imagine? Clearly, we talked about one area that may be flatter, and other areas we have no idea what it looks like. In other areas, it is more like a pipe. It's got to be pretty complex, huh?
Yeah, it's definitely not a pipe. If anything, it's a complex network of cracks. Dikes and sills is what we call them, depending on if they're horizontal or vertical. And this weaves its way through all the layers to get to the surface.
It's fascinating how much we really don't know, even on what I consider one of the most best studied volcanoes on the entire planet, huh?
That's right. And the more earthquakes that happen, the more we learn, because the earthquakes send their seismic waves through the rock. And when we record those at the other end at our stations, we measure not only the earthquake, but also the properties of the rock in between. And so researchers look at that, and they can actually back out the material properties of the rock and things like how hot it might be, and its makeup, what type of rock it is. And through studies like this, and known as tomography, measuring the velocity changes underground, you can start to understand what's going on down there. And there have been studies like that in Hawaii, many of which, but there need to be more. Down at the south flank of the volcano, the earthquake activity continues in full force. So there was a magnitude 6.9 earthquake on May 4th, 2018. Kicked off a lot of aftershocks, which are continuing to this day. And we think to a level that is higher than you would expect for normal aftershock decay. And so we think that this is in part forced by the continued south flank motion that's going on there.
So it wasn't just one jerk, and we're still feeling the effects of one jerk. It's still kind of jerking a little bit?
Exactly, yeah. So the system, it's not as simple as just an earthquake. It was an earthquake, and then it, to some extent, opened up, because the eruption opened up the rift zone so much and created this mobile south flank, or more mobile south flank. The area is still adjusting and not settling as fast as it might normally do. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a plot of that original earthquake,
right,
and some of the models that USGS has put out of the area that may be actually ruptured and moved, and some of the arrows you guys see on there are the actual GPS stations. Is that correct?
Yeah. So this comes from GPS data. We have measured basically on the order of 5 meters of slip, co-seismic slip, which means during the earthquake that occurred during that eruption. So this lower left plot here illustrates that. So all the arrows point toward the south, and then the area roughly that I circled, I'll circle a little bit better, shows where we see that deformation, and it actually corresponds quite nicely with where a lot of the earthquakes, the initial aftershocks, were occurring. So there's in the bathymetry, you can't see it well on this map, but there's a topographic high out here, and they call it the kind of the toe stop of the island, if you will, where the south flank is buttressed or held up by that there, and the earthquakes activated that whole area. And we think this is the area from the Décollement fault, which is that shallow basal fault between the volcanic pile and the crust below. And this thing can slip, and the 6.9 earthquake slipped it all the way out to that so-called toe offshore,
Right.
Which matches the deformation modeling really well.
It's like a lump, right? Like where the slope changes and it's piling up there somehow.
Right, it piles up and it actually starts to go uphill. So it basically supports and keeps the island from sliding anymore. So the south flank is moving all the time. I mean, we can see that it created the poly down in the park, for example, and that and other faults are evidence of this down dropping that occurs from that southward motion. But it can only go so far, because eventually offshore it hits this stop. And the earthquakes during the eruption, hundreds of aftershocks that we measured, especially in the first several days, filled up that area. It was pretty amazing seeing that. I think we had one plot, this showed it. So the little dashed area drawn here illustrates that same area. The bathymetry is not shown, but when you overlay bathymetry with this, you see the high areas, various seamounts and high topography out there, which matches to where the earthquake stopped. And this also shows, by the way, the numbers, these are the magnitudes from different foreshocks and aftershocks. So you can see there's a 5.3, 4.6, and 5.1, and so on. The main shock being the 6.9 right here. So there have been, I believe, 15, at least 15 events over magnitude 4 so far in the sequence.
Yeah, and that's normal?
Yeah, that's what we would expect, and most of them occurred near the main event. We've had a few stragglers continue to occur, and that's normal. People might remember that I think it was either the 5.1 or the 5.3 happened a day before, and then an hour before the main shock was another big earthquake. In fact, I felt it driving in my car. That's how strong that one was. And then of course the big one happened an hour after that. It's a really nice example of an aftershock sequence.
One here, then one there, then one here.
Right, and if you have one here, one there, you're rupturing different segments of that and relieving that strain that's built up over years, and it makes it less likely that it's all going to go at once. So the good news for this is we just had this event. The previous one in this area was 45 years before. It might be that long again until the next one happens, at least in this area.
Oh, fascinating. But as far as the 4s and maybe a low 5, is that still possible?
Yes. Yeah, this is earthquake country after all. We have earthquakes here a lot. Whether they're related to this aftershock sequence or whether they're related to settling on other faults around the island, or even related to flexure of the lithosphere or the crust beneath the island, earthquakes of that size can happen, and they do from time to time. Yeah.
Can we look a little more closely at the South Flank events?
Yeah, sure. So the magnitude 6.9 earthquake in 2018 set off an aftershock sequence that, in fact, if you look here on this plot, you can see this lower plot shows the past 2 years of earthquakes per week that we're seeing in the South Flank region. You can see a rather low amount of seismicity throughout 2017 and early 2018, and then it jumps way up with the 6.9 earthquake. And it tails off. You see that nice curve, that's the decay, the aftershock decay. But rather than just tailing off and going back to where it should be, where it would normally have been, you can see it's just picked up and stayed pretty level at a high amount since then. And that's the activity we think is being driven by the south flank motion of the south flank right now. And by the way, the upper plot here shows the last 50 years of earthquakes since 1970 in this same region. You can see, and generally it's pretty low until the events of 18, which were really unprecedented.
Right. There's a little bump there right after the 75 earthquake.
There is, yeah. So the 1975 magnitude 7.7 earthquake is right in there, and you can see that its sequence is hardly even noticeable compared to 2018. But keep in mind that the monitoring network was different then. Even though I've tried to account for that with these plots, it is possible that you're not seeing the whole picture of the older earthquakes.
Yeah, there could be still some influence there, even though you've done everything possible to minimize that. Yeah. So fascinating. This is the south flank has been active in the monitoring record.
Right.
So can we expect more earthquakes like this in the future? How big might those be?
So how big an earthquake can we have here? And people have asked themselves that. We know we had the 7.9 Great Kīlauea earthquake in 1868, and models of the rupture zone for that seem to have covered around maybe 2/3 of the south flank of the island, the southeast section of the whole island. And so there's a little bit that we think it didn't rupture. So basically the area of the lower east drift zone. And so basically if we had an earthquake of that size that also ruptured all the way to the eastern tip of the island, it could exceed magnitude 8, or at least reach magnitude 8. That's what we think is the largest.
Largest theoretically possible.
Theoretically possible. So an earthquake magnitude is tied to the energy released, which is also related to the fault area. So the bigger the fault area, the more energy can be released, the bigger the magnitude.
So we've mentioned that earthquakes are still possible, and this is not something people should panic about if they feel a regular earthquake, but rather it's something they can take action about. What can we do if we feel an earthquake?
Well, one thing you can do, assuming it's not a big earthquake, is you can report that you felt it. You can go to the Did You Feel It website, Did You Feel It, USGS webpage, and you can help us out, because we don't have seismometers everywhere, but we have people everywhere. So you can be a seismometer and help us out. And even if it is a big earthquake, you can even go back later and do it for old earthquakes. But if it's a lot amount of shaking, certainly safety first. And the three things are drop, cover, and hold on until the shaking stops. And I think we have a video to illustrate that.
The earthquakes you see in movies are one thing, but real life is a completely different animal. Just because you can't predict an earthquake doesn't mean that you can't prepare for one. In the event of a real earthquake, you should drop, cover, and hold on. Visit ready.gov/earthquake and practice what to do to keep you and your family safe in the event of a real earthquake. And you'll be seen as a hero by your family and your loved ones.
When the earth shakes, the ground moves, and things start to fall, you'll ask yourself, how prepared or unprepared are you?
Fundamentally, it's about practicing drop, cover, and hold on. And dropping makes sense so you don't fall, because shaking sometimes is so much you can't stand. And then cover, because your ceiling can come down. Things can fall on you, so you want to make sure something's above you as a shield. So it could be a table, anything like that. And then hold on, because the shaking could make it hard for you to keep that table, for example, over you. So hold on until it stops. And that's it, basically. If you're at the beach, when the shaking stops, get away in case there's a tsunami.
Right, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. People can also practice this anytime. And every October, we remind ourselves of this with the Great Shakeout Hawaii. So the Great Shakeout is a public awareness campaign about earthquake preparedness and safety that you can learn all about it at greatshakeout.org/Hawaii. And there's a lot of educational materials there, a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, so we'd like to think that people in Hawaii are pretty well practiced at dealing with earthquakes.
Yes, we feel them a lot here, that's for sure. And we had a lot of practice in 2018, especially those of us in Volcano feeling earthquakes every day. But you can't get complacent. You have to keep your preparedness up. For example, have your water ready and your kit that you would use for any natural disaster, including hurricanes or anything else, so that you're prepared in case power's out or you have to be cut off for a while. But in terms of the immediate safety, it's just dropping, covering, and holding on until the shaking stops. And because there are aftershocks from large earthquakes, we just looked at some examples from the 6.9. Usually after the main shock, if you can, then you would leave your house, just in case your house structure is weakened. You don't want an aftershock to come along and then make more things fall down on your head. So
the house might be already weakened, and so you want to make sure you're out in the open, right?
Right.
That's what you're saying.
Right. So other than that's pretty simple. And this is earthquake country, as they say, and this is the third highest level of seismicity in the whole country. Here we are in Hawaii, just behind Alaska and California. So this is one of the hot spots for earthquakes.
And the big ones maybe are not as common as the small ones, right?
That's right.
So maybe the big ones are worth planning a little more for. Maybe each room of your house, what's the place I'm gonna go get under? That's something you can think about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Different areas, at your work, where would you get under?
Right.
That kind of thing, right? That's the kind of preparedness we're talking about.
Yeah, and the Shakeout website that I mentioned has good resources about all those scenarios. What if you're here? What if you're there? If I mentioned the beach, but if you're at work or you're at school, what do you do differently? If you don't have a table, what do? You go next to the wall, actually, is what you do. But the old advice of using a doorway is not really useful. What they say is just drop where you are, cover your head, even if you're just using your hands, cover your head, and make sure that you're protected.
I've heard of people putting pots over their heads even.
Well, I guess that could be better than nothing, I suppose. Yeah, you don't have a lot of time always. So one thing is to know that earthquakes, especially the farther away they are, the more separation in time there's going to be between the P wave shaking, the primary shaking, and then the S wave shaking, the secondary shaking. The P wave will feel like a sharp jolt. Usually that's not very damaging. Okay, it might get your attention though. The S wave shaking is where the real rolling happens, side to side and in circles, and that's what can really bring down structures and it causes more damage. And so, again, the farther away it is, the more time there is between. It could be, several seconds in between, let's say. And so, if you feel that jolt, just know that's your warning. And if you're far enough away before the rolling happens, good for you, because you'll have a second to get ready.
Right. That's great advice. So thank you, Brian, for joining us today and answering a lot of our questions about seismicity in Hawaii Island. We're doing this interview at the Kuʻuʻōʻō School, and we'd like to thank Kuʻuʻōʻō and the recovery efforts after their displacement from last year's eruption.
Yes.
And thank you for the USGS for sharing all this fantastic data with us. If people want to get more USGS data, where should they go?
Just go to the HVO website at volcanoes.usgs.gov/HVO.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, so that was our interview with Brian from 5 years ago. Interesting to note the parallels. A lot of it's the same kind of thing. I thought I'd show you guys the last month of the south flank here. Looks pretty similar to how much he was showing it moving still over there. And if I go to the last year, you can't even see where the actual shape of the land underneath, all the earthquakes underneath there. So that's all still happening. South flank is still active. He talks about how it would be great if there was more studies of the Pahala zone. That's all been happening in the years ever since. No results coming out yet, but that's all coming. So yeah, fascinating to kind of check in on where we were. And I think it's always good to hear a different perspective, a different voice, even if they're saying similar things, just to maybe it lands a little different for some people. What are your thoughts 5 years later?
Yeah, it's a great interview. I'm glad. I wish Brian was still here. You're wondering, why is that guy not on the show more often? He is no longer in Hawaii, and that's the main reason. But we really enjoyed that interview, and
he got a promotion, and he's in Colorado now with USGS still.
So otherwise it's a good way to break apart the South Pahala or the Deep Pahala earthquakes, the flex quakes, and then the quakes related to volcanic activity and some of the variants in between there that we always end up talking about one way or another. So it's great to have him just break them down there.
All right. It's been a while. Let's wrap it up here. We got some questions, discussions.
Not much, just one little one. I'll let you just have a comment on it. I did talk about it in the chat already, but Eric asked, couldn't magnitude 8.0 on the south end of the island cause a tsunami?
Yes. Yeah. Statewide.
Yeah. And the thing about the tsunami that's most important to me is the speed at which it happens. Because when we talk about the Aleutian Islands, Chile, Japan, we're talking about hours and hours of lead time. We know well ahead of what this thing's going to be before it gets here. You get one of those earthquakes on the south side of the island, it's on the north side of the island in less than 3 minutes, into the other islands in 5. continue all the way across the islands in 15 to 20. So you don't have time before it's on you. And that's the scariest
If
part.
you recall our 1868 coverage, right? People were on Waiohinu looking down at the ocean. They saw the ocean bubbling offshore, and then they saw a wave come in, and they just saw everyone get washed out down below them. There was no time for anything else to happen.
Yep.
So that's why it's maybe one of the best pieces of advice is what Brian said there. You know, if you're by the ocean and you feel one of those earthquakes that's big enough to give you trouble to stand, where it's shaking that much, that is a tsunami-genic earthquake. It's big enough because of tsunami. Go inland immediately as soon as the shaking stops.
Mm-hmm.
That's really it. If you can remember that, then you know that's your alarm. There's not going to be a siren. That's your alarm.
Yep. I think that's it for the week. We will be back next week at our standard time, 5 p.m. on Thursdays, unless something happens. Kind of quiet right now, but you never know. And if something does go like an eruption, then we will go live. And otherwise, we'll be back. Or are we changing it? No, it's next week. We will be normal, right? It's the week after we're talking about changing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So next week we'll be back at a regular time, Thursday. The following week, Halloween evening is on Thursday, so we're gonna bump it to Wednesday the 30th instead. That's what's going on. Yeah.
All right.
All right. So mahalo everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Mahalo to our ASO interpreters, as always, Carrie and Dano. Appreciate you guys and making our content more accessible to our Islands of Deaf community. Mahalo to Lou in the back end as well. And until next week, from the nonprofit Hawaiian Volcano Education and Resilience Institute, or HVERI, and Dane DuPont, and I am Philip Ong. Until next week, aloha everyone.